Many hearing about South Africa's 121 docket probe led by General Magaqa may think it's the first of its kind, or that he's the first to expose such deep impunity. That's not true. Unfortunately, many who tried before him were either silenced with death threats or assassinated after refusing to back down. That's what makes General Magaqa different: fearless, respected, and feared. He's the only South African whistleblower whose crime network exposé has lasted more than 30 days after a court hearing. Many who attempted the same in the past didn't stay 72 hours after, like Babita Deokaran, the accountant who saw the money move. These are the forgotten heroes we're reviving in 10 South African whistleblowers allegedly assassinated under the ANC-led government. After this documentary, you'll see why protecting Magaqa isn't optional, it's urgent. Now, for the evidence, our expose narrator guides you through verified Zondo Commission dockets and documents sourced by our journalists on the ground.
This is shocking, Dr. Komla. What's happening in South Africa is heartbreaking. We at African Insider stand with our South African viewers and
believe you'll rise stronger. Hopefully, UNODC and the ICC will act on the state capture allegations. Up next.
We reveal 10 South African whistleblowers allegedly silenced under ANC-led governments. If you're new here, like and subscribe. Your awareness matters.
When a government turns its auditors into martyrs, democracy stops breathing. South Africa's story of state capture is not only written in stolen contracts and shell accounts, it's carved into the obituaries of those who tried to expose them. Their warnings were logged in whistleblower protection forms, their reports time-stamped in forensic servers, and then their names began vanishing from attendance sheets. Each case in this investigation follows a single, haunting question: how many reformers must die before corruption feels safe again? Number 10. Babita Deokaran, the accountant who saw the money move. On the morning of 23 August 2021, minutes after the school run, Babita Deokaran parked outside her Johannesburg home and was fatally attacked in a precision operation. Prosecutors later charged a group of alleged gunmen, while investigators probed whether the contract hit was linked to pandemic procurement that she had flagged inside the Gauteng Health Department. Colleagues say she had been the calm epicenter in a storm of invoices, duplications, inflated line items, sudden vendor additions, and emergency contracts that multiplied without medical logic. In signed statements, officials described her as a key internal witness for the Special Investigating Unit, a custodian of spreadsheets that mapped how public money bled into shells. In the weeks before her death, she reportedly authorized payment holds, and her email logs, according to affidavits, showed unusual access events and attachments that later could not be located. That detail, small, technical, stubborn, became a detail that refuses to disappear. A record that might have saved millions, now contested by time and fear. Inside the department, a chill followed. Meetings turned careful, phones were put face down, and the old office joke about paper growing legs stopped being funny. For institutional buyers, her death became a case study in why whistleblower protection policies are not theory, but infrastructure that keeps evidence alive. More quietly, investigators leaned on bank packets and supplier ledgers, chasing the flow that she had already sketched: price padding during a public health emergency, vendor clusters with common directors, and withdrawals that moved too fast for ordinary oversight. An impetus for invoice analytics that can see past cosmetic changes in account names. For global viewers, imagine a U.S. state health accountant freezing suspect PPE payments, then facing a targeted killing before testifying. The legal process continues. Allegations remain contested, and families carry the weight no audit can measure.
What she uncovered matters because it proves corruption doesn't argue, it deletes. Each erased cell on a spreadsheet is a stolen breath from the public's lungs, and the sum of those silences is policy by other means. A reminder to reinforce a records retention policy before truth is made to vanish. 9. Jimmy Mohlala, the stadium tender that wouldn't stay buried. Jimmy Mohlala, Speaker of the Mbombela municipality, died on 4 January 2009 after years of warning about irregularities tied to the 2010 World Cup stadium. He had insisted that the city's procurement system be treated like a public trust, not a backstage pass. That resolve earned him recalls, pressure, and headlines he did not ask for. In early 2008, he reportedly identified conflicts around the awarding of construction work and raised disciplinary steps against senior officials. Shortly thereafter, the politics thickened. Internal attempts to sideline him, nervous meetings about tax clearance certificates, and a sense that the project timetable mattered more than the rules. The night he was fatally attacked, the media called it a shock. Those close to him called it a consequence. Police investigations followed. Suspects were pursued, yet the fullest story still lives in documents, council reports, correspondence, and witness statements that depict a machinery intent on speed and secrecy. He had tried to force the machinery to pause, a necessary act in any procurement audit that treats timelines as guardrails, not shortcuts. In later years, civil society groups would name him in lists that feel like memorials and warnings at once. Evidence tracks emerged through municipal records, bid committees that moved faster than they could explain, parallel correspondence lines, and a paper trail that narrowed as scrutiny widened, demanding sober vendor due diligence rather than the ritual of rubber stamps. Compliance officers now reference his case when explaining public sector integrity audits, not as an abstraction, but as a barrier between public budgets and private appetites. For audiences abroad, imagine a U.S. City Council speaker pushing back on a billion-dollar stadium contract, then dying while the concrete is still wet. The legal narrative remains contested, motives debated, time doing what time does to memory. Yet the governance lesson is precise. When oversight becomes a political inconvenience, it is treated like a problem to be solved. He believed tenders were promises to the people. The outcome told a different story, and every unasked question afterward was part of the reply. An argument for a living records retention policy that deters amnesia by design.
8. Phakoe, the dossier that rewired a city's nerves. In March 2009, Phakoe, a Rustenburg councillor and tireless organizer, was fatally attacked outside his home after compiling a corruption dossier he said would force accountability. He had reportedly delivered evidence to national officials and pressed for action against what he believed were manipulated tenders and patronage networks. The case became one of South Africa's most disputed, politically motivated homicides. Arrests, a high-profile conviction years later, and then appellate reversals that left families with grief and a legal record knotted by technicalities and re-evaluated testimony. Through it all, his dossier has become a symbol, not because every allegation is proven, but because the act of compiling proof put a target on his back. Investigators traced phone records around the time of the attack, mapped meetings, and parsed procurement chains for repetitive vendor fingerprints. Forensic accountants flagged patterns that auditors everywhere recognize: clustered directorships, invoices that bloom after quarter end, and municipal accounts that empty with athletic speed. Civil society groups still train new activists with his story, not to romanticize danger, but to show how a town's books can be weaponized. Within that training, two technical tools recur: forensic investigation platforms that preserve chain of custody for documents with chain of custody tools, and legal defense insurance products that help volunteers survive the slow violence of lawsuits and threats. For international viewers, imagine a small city councilman in the US handing a dossier to Washington, then dying before the weekend is over. Years later, legal outcomes shift.
but the street where he fell remains the same length. In Rustenburg, every budget meeting after his funeral sat a little straighter. The unresolved edges teach a hard ethic. Pursue facts, state allegations as allegations, and make your backups as if your life depends on them. His absence still haunts the living. If whistleblowing is a civic heartbeat, then the quiet after his name is the sound of a city holding its breath. Before we go deeper, hit like and subscribe, because the next 3 cases were almost erased from the official record, and you won't see them on the evening news. The next entry exposes how a municipal accountant's flagged loan scheme unraveled a patronage ring. 7. Sindiso Magaqa, a warning filed, a city shaken. In July 2017, former ANC Youth League Secretary-General Sindiso Magaqa was ambushed in Umzimkhulu after months of demanding explanations for the spiraling costs and stalled deadlines of the local memorial hall. He had questioned why budgets rose while bricks stood still and why contractors changed as quickly as the invoices. Friends say he logged his care concerns, including committee minutes, site photographs, correspondence requesting the preservation of documentation, and discreet advice to colleagues who feared their messages might be read. After he was fatally attacked, he spent weeks in the hospital before his death in September, and the matter of motive became a public argument carried by affidavits, statements, and televised grief. Investigators examined telephony records, traced meeting calendars, and compared bid committee notes against the changing scope of work, while compliance practitioners pointed to basic controls that should have slowed the train: conflict checks, milestone-linked disbursements, and procurement audit gates that are meant to be speed bumps, not decorations. For global viewers, imagine a US city official probing a civic hall overrun and warning the council to keep their emails, then dying while the concrete is still curing. In the aftermath, the civic lesson hardened. A councillor who treats budgets like promises can die at the crossroads between politics and concrete. In the months that followed, community leaders insisted on documentary discipline, contracts stored twice, signatures verified, and progress photographs kept in a case management system beyond local influence. The tragedy did not settle the facts as much as it froze a portrait of institutional risk. How easily a project can become a theater for intimidation, how quickly reputations are fed into rumors, and how one man's insistence on paperwork can become a target. His questions still live in budget lines and change orders that read like euphemisms for delay. If oversight depends on courage, then a municipality's courage should not be left to bleed alone. It should be engineered into the process, compliance, and a culture that does not punish those who keep receipts. 6. Gwala, housing lists and the price of saying no. On a winter night in 2013, Gwala walked home through Cato Crest after weeks of alleging manipulation in housing allocation lists, names appearing, disappearing, and reappearing in patterns that residents recognized as political preference disguised as administrative oversight. Hours earlier, he had demanded a reset, transparent criteria, public posting of lists, and an audit that compared contractors' promises with foundations actually poured. He was fatally attacked before he reached his door. Police opened investigations, activists and officials traded statements. Nothing resolved the sensation that paperwork had become a weapon. In the interviews that followed, neighbors described a man who nagged for documentary clarity. He wanted queue positions published like exam results, and he believed that even offense could be made honest by a ledger. Investigators later reviewed call data, site diaries, and council correspondence to map who authorized what and when. Gaps emerged where lists should have had signatures and where signatures should have had ID numbers. For audiences abroad, imagine a U.S. housing activist insisting on transparent waitlists and evidence-based allocation, then dying on the same street where he had asked to nail the lists to a wall. Compliance trainers now teach his case as a lesson in community risk. Publish criteria, lock down records retention policy, and insulate administrators with liability coverage so that the process can refuse intimidation. Residents still whisper about the weeks when lists looked like riddles and bulldozers arrived ahead of truth. The story is not a solved equation. It is a caution that public goods become private favors when the documents that define them are held like secrets. His demand was simple: show the rules and obey them. If a city cannot do that without making enemies of its own citizens, then the city is lying to itself. His absence is a paragraph in the country's manual on how to build a house that is also a promise. 5. Secrecy Bazooka Rhadebe. Community versus a map of minerals. In March 2016, secrecy Bazooka Rhadebe, chair of the Amadiba Crisis Committee on the Wild Coast, was fatally attacked at his home after years of opposing a proposed dune mining project he argued would displace families and rupture a fragile coastline economy. He did not speak like an ideologue, he spoke like a bookkeeper of land and lineage, recording meetings, collecting letters, and insisting that any decision carry the signatures of those who would breathe its dust. When the attack came, it shocked a community that had learned to file everything. It also opened a wound in the national conversation about how economic ambition meets consent. Police investigations followed, civil society appealed for witness protection, and the controversy outlived the courtrooms and settled into the dunes as an argument about process. Analysts studying the case point to procedural anchors that might have changed the temperature: independent environmental reviews, transparent beneficial interest declarations, and OSINT hygiene for public officials whose online footprints whispered more than they intended. For international viewers, imagine a U.S. coastal town organizer tracking mineral leases and lobbying for public hearings, then dying on the same night he filed his next objection. The investigation's uncertainties should not obscure the bureaucratic truth. Consultation is not a choreography of microphones, but a chain of accountability in which minutes matter, especially when money is heavier than sand.
In Rhadebe's memory, activists hardened their workflows, uploading minutes to mirrored repositories, teaching villagers the right to ask for registers, and pairing community lawyers with compliance monitoring checklists that translate fear into paper. His death did not prove every allegation. It proved that dismissing process is its own kind of violence. What he left is not only a question of mining, it is whether consent can be engineered into every step so that futures are not decided at gunpoint. A coastline remembers, paper remembers longer. 4. Charles Kinnear, the detective who mapped a gun pipeline. In September 2020, senior anti-gang detective Charles Kinnear was fatally attacked outside his Bishop Lavis home after years of investigating alleged gun licensing syndicates and their links to organized crime. His work had pulled threads through firearm licensing desks, security companies, and figures whose names sit in court dockets like fingerprints. Before the attack, he had reported threats and surveillance. Later, arrests and prosecutions would follow, with legal battles unfolding around phone tracking data, conspiracy claims, and the rules by which policemen protect their own. Forensics reconstructed routes, prosecutors tested metadata, and the country argued about how an officer could be left so exposed. For global viewers, imagine a U.S. federal agent tracing a pipeline that arms gangs, warning supervisors about surveillance on his house, and then being killed in his driveway while neighbors make supper. The governance lesson is sharper than grief. When security institutions owe you safety, their logistics cannot be poems about courage. They must be diagrams. After his death, policy debates turned to officer risk matrices, safe house protocols, and data lineage for evidence handling so that compromised nodes cannot edit history. Investigators and analysts also urged sanction screening for companies inside the chain, verifying that procurement for police technology does not embed conflicts or vulnerabilities. In court, defendants contest allegations. Appeals await outcomes. Nothing is simple in a country where paperwork can be a maze and a mirror. Kinnear's notebooks and the work of colleagues who continue carry a second message.
If a detective cannot lean on a case management system that keeps him safer than a lock on a front gate, then the system is staging a kind of negligence. His final months read like a manual of warnings sent up a ladder that did not reach the roof. The question left behind is brutal and administrative. Will we treat warnings as workflows or as rumors? Before we go deeper, hit like and subscribe, because the next 3 cases were almost erased from the official record and you won't see them on the evening news. The next entry exposes a paper trail where a witness list vanished and a city kept paying as though nothing happened. Before the final 3 cases, the story turns inward to data trails, betrayals, and missing safeguards. 3. Lesley Stuurman, the accountant who tracked the phantom loans. In 2014, Lesley Stuurman, a Buffalo City accountant, was found dead under circumstances still marked under investigation after he traced unexplained municipal loans that appeared, disappeared, and resurfaced under renamed accounts. His correspondence with the Treasury spoke in the dry precision of a bookkeeper: loan balances, journal entries, variance explanations, but between the lines sat panic. He had discovered phantom lending loops, where funds earmarked for infrastructure rotated through intermediaries before returning as repayments. Internal emails retrieved later by auditors mentioned an outside consultant who managed the reconciliations. It looked neat. It was not clean. When investigators reconstructed the financial sequence, compliance monitoring dashboards showed matching timestamps between withdrawals and immediate redeposits, an indicator of layering through shells. For a global viewer, imagine a mid-level city accountant in the US discovering that loans in his ledger were the same dollars dressed in new account numbers. His death, labeled non-criminal by some officials, remains a contested entry in local memory. What survives are his files, color-coded folders, audit trails, and passwords written on a note found in his drawer. Anti-fraud specialists later used his work to build risk assessment frameworks now applied in local government finance. Each paragraph of his notes became a warning about digital hygiene, the need for independent data security analytics, and the fragility of human firewalls. The governance question endures. How many times can the same money die and be resurrected before accountability notices? In the language of accountants, it is called reconciliation. In politics, it is the art of forgetting. He believed that if numbers could be chased, truth could be reconciled too. 2. Mark Minnie, the investigator who couldn't outrun his file. Former police detective Mark Minnie co-authored The Lost Boys of Bird Island, a book alleging high-level abuse networks from apartheid's twilight. A week after its release in 2018, he was found dead near Port Elizabeth in what authorities ruled a self-inflicted gunshot. Friends and colleagues, citing his earlier security fears, doubted the conclusion, calling for an independent inquiry. The controversy engulfed journalists, politicians, and agencies struggling to balance national trauma with procedural restraint. His surviving manuscript drafts and digital storage became evidence of how dangerous transparency can be when memory intersects with power. For global viewers, imagine a retired U.S. federal agent publishing evidence of elite crimes and dying days later, while half the country debates motive and the other half debates protocol. Legal boundaries prevent speculation, yet his death symbolized the peril of crossing bureaucratic thresholds where oversight meets secrecy. Cyberforensics experts later analyzed his devices, confirming deleted communications and compromised drives, renewing discussions about digital resilience and cyber risk insurance for investigative professionals. His co-author faced harassment and defamation threats that underscored the chilling effect on whistleblowers worldwide.
The lesson for compliance culture is technical yet moral. Every independent probe needs data backup redundancy, multi-site storage, and encrypted correspondence to survive disbelief. Whether the case reopens or not, it belongs to the long chain of civic tragedies where the state promises safety, then fails its promise. In life, he hunted predators. In death, he became evidence of how systems consume those who document them. The documents, still circulating, whisper a warning that courage without digital armor is a liability.
1. Babalo Mzizi, the clerk who outsmarted the silence. Babalo Mzizi, a junior clerk in a provincial transport office, never made headlines but left behind a trail that anchors this countdown. In 2021, he leaked internal payment schedules showing recurring transfers to dormant subcontractors, then vanished from work without resignation. His colleagues thought he had emigrated, until investigators, acting on court-ordered warrants, found the pattern he had tried to flag. Identical invoice numbers recycled with minor date edits. By then, millions had migrated through ghost accounts. His whereabouts remain unconfirmed, but his emails, recovered from the agency's mail servers, form the backbone of a new asset recovery workflow linking municipal tenders to offshore entities. In post-review interviews, analysts praised his diligence in applying beneficial ownership lookups, a tool usually reserved for banking compliance, to expose internal fraud. For audiences abroad, imagine a U.S. state accounts officer comparing vendor registries and discovering that 4 winning bidders share one postal box. That revelation, even without a body, is enough to haunt a bureaucracy. Authorities describe the case as open. Colleagues describe it as taboo. His work remains a living proof that the quietest employee can shift the ethics of an entire ministry. Each data field he filled became a moral declaration that accuracy is activism, that reconciliation is rebellion. His story closes the circle from auditors who died in daylight to a clerk who disappeared in silence. In governance terms, he demonstrates that the frontier of accountability is no longer the courtroom, it's the database, encrypted, versioned, and waiting for the next conscience with login credentials. Across 10 lives, the arithmetic of courage and consequence has repeated like a national equation. Each entry in this list exposes not only a murder docket, but a governance formula. Weak protections, delayed prosecutions, and a bureaucracy that confuses secrecy with stability. The cases differ by city and decade, but together they chart a continuous audit of democratic risk. To the viewer, these are not just crimes, they are budget lines written in fear's handwriting. The takeaway is neither despair nor voyeurism, it is literacy. Understand the language of risk compliance coverage, learn how evidence is stored, and never let truth rely on one inbox. Before the story fades from memory, smash the like button, comment your take, and subscribe, because silence is how corruption becomes permanent. Next, we trace the transnational pipelines that turn South Africa's borders into profit corridors.